So I have a fun topic, and you can see here, expected and particularly delightful, unexpected transformation, issues in building a learning ecosystem. So I will share a case study. It has its roots here at Stanford University. You will see that it is definitely an ecosystem that has evolved. There are aspects related to education, certainly, learning, ask any faculty, never training, of course, but you will see elements integrated throughout. And in terms of the relationship with AI, you could definitely say this is technology enabled, data supported, and arguably AI intrigued. So instead, what I think might be more interesting is to share the journey around this particular ecosystem. And you can see what's worked, what hasn't, and then the implications for all of you is how this might fit into any other aspects that you consider related to AI. Okay, so a little bit of history here. How many of you have heard of ME310 at Stanford? All right, so you get to be some of the ringers in the room. So ME310 is a long-running, award-winning class at Stanford. ME is short for mechanical engineering. 310 is the course designation, which means this is a master's level class for engineering students. Now, this class has been taught at Stanford since 1967. So technically, this is the 50th year anniversary for the class, and the premise has largely been the same. Student teams working on design challenges from companies. And the best part is if you have students in a class for an extended time, they get to be lab rats. So it's been a wonderful space to understand how do students work together, what is team collaboration, what is project-based learning, how the hell do companies understand what they get from the students in terms of this overall experience. And over the years, this class has been team taught by different Stanford faculty. And so the pedagogy has also evolved in response to what companies see as important for their needs at the time, for how students consider what is learning, right? If you ask any student now, what's email? Oh, that's old school, right? You have to get through them in terms of WhatsApp, texting. And if you ask them where is their biggest source of learning, library? Hell no, YouTube. Where else are you gonna get all your short videos and tutorials? So that also has changed in response. So a little bit about the class process. It's a year-long academic course tied to the Stanford academic calendar. So from September to June. The students start, as you can see here, with a problem, and they learn a bit about what's the expectation from the company, what's the design challenge, and over the course of the 9 months, remember academic calendar, the students do some need finding, which means they have to unpack the design challenge, understand what does it mean to define a user, what does it mean to define needs, follow that through with benchmarking, so getting out into the market space, doing some initial exploration and research, and then of course lots of different types of prototyping and a little bit of testing that they can do, and ultimately to deliver a functioning prototype by year end. So this is generally the flow that the students follow. In reality, this is what they experience. So when you talk about education and learning, you always have two different realities, right? And even learning gets unpacked in terms of formal versus informal learning. So I appreciate all of you are soaking up the great knowledge that I'm sharing, but at the same time, you're sitting in chairs, you're passively receiving this information. How much it will stick in your head by the end of today? If I'm lucky, 10%. In 1 week, 1%, right? I mean, these are numbers we know, studies show this. Hopefully you'll reach out to me and maybe we can boost that up to 0.01% in about 2 weeks' time, a month time. For the students, the learning is very much hands-on, it's tactile, and it's project-driven. So they're gonna learn by doing. They're gonna learn by asking a lot of questions, and they're gonna learn by going through hell. All of which is effective in the way that humans interact. And for the students, they bring all of this learning into the career, into the workplace, going through this. Now for the students, they start out, you can see here at the top, there's a teaching team that supports them. They work with faculty. The faculty are supported by TAs, teaching assistants. They also have, you can see here, project coaches, and then of course admin staff. This is in the context of ME310. Then the students have to work, of course, with the company. the industry liaison. And of course, the company has other colleagues and groups that they have to bring into the mix, right? What are the students doing? Are they making progress on this design challenge? Do you understand the deliverables that are coming back from Stanford? And then on the right, the students have to get the stuff done. So many of them are coming from engineering backgrounds, but not all the problems today are engineering driven. Now, because it's an ME, mechanical engineering class, they typically take an engineering bias. But I'll tell you, the questions from the companies have evolved. So for example, in the early years, the San Francisco cable car company brought a problem to the students. We're talking, what is this, 1960, early 60s, and said, can you build us a better brake? This hasn't been improved on in the prior 100 years. Great challenge for students to work on. In recent years, the companies have brought much more open-ended challenges, more long range. So for example, SAP a few years ago said, forget that you think of us as an enterprise software company. Tell us about the future of retail. My students are like, what? What does this mean? And the challenges are also much more about the broader solution. So how does technology, how does AI fit into this? And help us understand how this connects to service, to people, to the bigger ecosystem that we have to operate in as a company. So for the students, really interesting. And so in terms of outside help, they're going to pay a roommate. You can program, right? Come here. I've got a project budget. You can do some graphic design, great. So this is good experience for them. And then this bottom layer is very important. In the last decade, the Stanford teaching team realized that the way we work is distributed and it's global, right? So they had every Stanford student team, typically 4 students per team, partnered with a student team at another institution. Well, guess what? Now you had a project, Stanford with Aalto University in Finland. Second project, Stanford with USTC of China, or Stanford with Swinburne Institute of Technology in Australia. So all around the world, very quick for students to realize the pain of dealing with time zones, if any of you know about that, and great real-world experience to think about how they work together. So you can see some sample corporate projects here, usual big names, Microsoft. I mentioned SAP, car companies like BMW, we have Saab this year, IKEA, and so forth. So very good for students to see how to work with this. And the international part has been nicknamed Sugar. So for every Stanford project that's working with an international partner, and also imagine every one of those international partners has more than one project typically. So they've got other projects in their class that are partnered with other schools in the same ecosystem. This is a lot to take in. You can see here clearly it's a global phenomenon that has been created organically or bottom up in the last decade. And a little bit of how the name Sugar came about. So any of you have heard of Celia Cruz? Just a couple, very famous salsa singer. And when you deal with international partners, you get to hear international examples. And so one of the Stanford professors of ME310 was walking, and this is about the end of the first year into the second year, and said, okay, we need a name to call this group where we're working with international teams. And there's 2 faculty from Columbia and said, oh, well, we need something that has evocative. And if you've ever been to a concert from Celia Cruz, and I believe she's passed away a number of years ago, she had a gesture. And it all started in response to a comment about how she likes her coffee. And long story short, the shout was azúcar, which means sugar, translated, but it comes with a movement and a fist pump. And so everybody would do this. And suddenly, if you talk about ecosystem dynamics, learning education matter, but there's also the cultural aspects. It's the identification that comes with having a name that means something. And if you wander around Stanford this week and you go over to the engineering side of the campus, and particularly the Peterson Engineering Lab, which has the D School in the building, but upstairs is the ME310 loft, all the global partners are there. So just do any of those shouts or say Sugar, and you'll get immediate friends, because the global kickoff is happening this week. I actually just came from there. So interesting aspect about a positive aspect of transformation. It's a nickname. They tried to turn it into an acronym for Stanford administration. what is it, Stanford University Global Alliance for Redesign, right, SUGAR. Stanford said, hell no. So, but part of the learning, name your ecosystem. Think about the identity that comes by creating a community together. And realize where you sit in that ecosystem affects your perception. So you see 3 quotes here, right? Larry Leifer is a senior faculty member here at Stanford. He probably has the longest tenure teaching ME310 out of any of the other professors who've taught this course. You have in the middle here Philip Skogstad, a repeat corporate sponsor, but also had spent time creating the international programs at other schools. In particular, he was at University of St. Gallen, a business school in Switzerland, if you know. And then here, Falk is the professor now at the University of St. Gallen, who's been creating and supporting the growth of this sugar ecosystem. And you can see how some of these quotes reveal quite a bit about what does it mean to be in the ecosystem, whether or not you like where you sit, and your dynamics and power relations with others, right? So if you talk about education and learning, it matters where you are. And if you're a student or you're a teacher or a sponsor, that's going to shape the kind of questions you ask, right? The conversations you have. Now, one of the big learnings is that how the network looks and how you can explain it. So I gave you some diagrams, but doesn't this help you envision it a little bit better? And the way to think about it is you've got Stanford right here, 10 teams typically, each one working on a corporate project. And then here you can see SAP is one of the company names. This is D-School Paris working with Nestle. Very much a broad ecosystem for how this comes together. And one of the other learnings is that you need a visual map to explain what it looks like to others, both internally and externally. So it started originally as a simple visual just to say, okay, who's in or out of the network, right? And there's some intense conversations with faculty about who gets to be sugar or not. But you can see how things have evolved, right? Very interesting and an important part of network identification. And part of this comes to understanding this conceptual model of team of teams. Now, you may have heard of this book. Has it been mentioned yet today?
No.
Great. I could introduce it to you. So this came out in 2015, I want to say. General Stanley McChrystal is a former general with the US Army, but he ran all of the American Special Forces a number of years ago, particularly during the raid of Osama bin Laden. Long story short, what he learned is that the military works, well, I should say the enemy works in terms of teams, versus the military really started as a chain of command and control. And part of how he pivoted the American military was to think in terms of overlapping networks, what he called team of teams. And now he's got a great consultancy because he's retired, so if you buy his book, you can hire his team. And realize this crosses over into the spheres of business, into education, into other arenas. This is helpful language because in the map I showed, you don't see the teams at the companies, you don't see the supporting teams, the coaches. So there's also other layers that are missing, and you certainly don't see the teams across the years. I just had showed you a snapshot from the last academic year. So one of the learnings about the network that they're still trying to grapple with at Sugar is how do you keep these players back in touch? And one of the limits of academia is they only think in terms of academic calendars versus relationships go in and out, right? A couple of last thoughts, and then we'll, I think, have you stand up for the next aspect. Just a little bit on terms of how Sugar is structured, very much around projects. I think this is a natural organizing unit for most people, certainly easy for students to understand. And one of my other favorite ecosystems, and I did some early research, is around DARPA, which is a US government agency. If you know them, they funded the development, so the precursor to the internet, but also GPS and ultrasound, aircraft stealth technology, but they are also structured in terms of projects. So very much a helpful organizing unit. And another important aspect around Sugar is that often when you have these networks that come together, particularly around an organizing constraint, or it helps to have more groups unite because you have critical mass, that typically somebody's going to have a dominant role. And in this case, Stanford has continued to play The spiritual hub, certainly Professor Larry Leifer, is a regular figurehead, whether or not he likes it, and kind of representative for network identity. And so interesting to me, I find very similar phenomenon exist across networks. And anytime humans are evolved, right? Across data and such. That said, when you have global teams working together, it's about teams, it's about people, and people like to meet, right? We're all sitting here together physically. There's a different dynamic, and the same holds true for the Sugar Network. They meet several times a year. As a full ecosystem, it's twice a year. So this week I mentioned is the global kickoff, and one of the exercises you can see here is a paper bike competition, which is great. Students love it. It's an exercise in understanding engineering design. You don't tape on a wheel, you have to let it roll. But they come together for a final showcase, and then they have what you call smaller team meetups to meet each other. So very important. So if you think about data ecosystems that have people, people have to talk, and people connect and create rapport in these in-person connections. So to think about how you build that in, because that's an important aspect for not just learning, but human connection, right? And that comes to creating the workspaces. So this is a specific lesson for the ME310 class and for Sugar. So here's a clean space. If you go there now, of course, messy, filled with people, but they're sister spaces at every one of these international schools. So this is from Paris, and then this one is from Portugal, Porto Polytechnic. So that's also an important part about creating and making spaces for reflection, for teamwork, for collaboration. All right, that said, one of the unexpected learnings, and I'll wrap up, is that you can't get people always to agree. You can get them to move hopefully in the same direction. And in the case here, you've got edge members who don't always abide by the rules, because who makes the rules, right? And part of what what Stanford can manage in ME310 are its immediate global partners, but then you've got the extended projects for the international schools that might somewhat align with the Stanford curriculum, but yet do their own thing. So you could see here, this is just a snapshot of a whiteboard, but you see the headings across the top? Do you have a syllabus? Do you have readings? What tools do you use? You know, and if you're working with Chinese schools, they're not going to be using Google Docs or Facebook apps. They're going to have WeChat and other instruments. And so this all impacts the team collaboration and the knowledge sharing across. And I love the quote here from Larry at the bottom. All right, so very fast teaser that I hope intrigued you about one case study, an example, and Stanford living this reality today. I encourage you, of course, to connect with me, and through Martha and the other colleagues, there's a lot more to discover on this topic. So thank you for your time.